the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is openness to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we get started and introduce our guest, we do want to mention briefly we have a Patreon account. You can find us at www.patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. We have made our Discord server available. Taylor's been leading some reading groups. There's some bonus material from those recordings and discussions that have been conducted so far and are available. So if you're enjoying what we're doing, please consider signing up as a patron. Today, Taylor and I are really excited to have Conor O'Day joining us. We're going to be having a look at Henri Atlan, specifically part 3, Spinoza, the Spinoza path, Immanent Causality, a Spinozist viewpoint on evolution and the theory of action, Spinozist neurophysiology, knowledge, glory, and on human dignity, Golems, and noise as a principle of self-organization. All of that coming from selective writings on self-organization, philosophy, bioethics, and Judaism. Taylor and I want to welcome Conor back to the show, and he's going to give us a little rundown on Atlan.
Conor, before you tell us about Henri Atlan, who is still alive and kicking at 94, we always have to ask, even if it's your second time back, doesn't matter how many times you come back, we got to hear some more origin stories. So I want to hear something. I want to hear about you first before we hear about Atlan. And if you weren't prepared for this, then you're going to have to fly on the seat of your pants and give us some little nugget. I mean, last time we had you on, we looked at cannibal metaphysics together. We had a lot of fun there. And I know we asked you a little bit about yourself there. So just reminding the listeners that they can check out that conversation, which isn't all that long ago, maybe 6 months or so, I feel. Just give us another nugget of Conor lore, and then I will give you free rein to start the show off telling us about Henri Atlan.
Probably the best place to go with this is, I don't know if I discussed sort of my trajectory from medieval studies to what you could call mathematical sociology or computational social sciences. One of the things that is interesting about actually stumbling onto Atlan late in life, and I think I actually stumbled onto him through Gilles Grelet's theory of the solitary sailor, believe it or not, is that a lot of the stuff that I was getting into when I was in what I'll call a temporary post-philosophical mode, I was reading a lot of complexity theory. So I was reading a lot of John H. Holland. I was reading a lot of Stu Kaufman. I was reading a lot of systems biology stuff. And of course, then I stumbled onto Edgar Morin, who is a very important systems theorist and philosopher in the French context. And that ended up bringing me back in many ways into one of my first and most important inspirators in philosophy. It was Michel Serres. And of course, Michel Serres is inspired by Atlan and Atlan's approach on noise. So the whole architecture of both interference and the parasite draws a lot on Atlan's work. And just as a little anecdotal thing, I can't even remember if I mentioned this last time, so I really apologize if I'm riffing over it again. But I did actually have the wonderful opportunity to have lunch with Michel Serres before he passed. He did actually specifically request that we did not discuss philosophy, so we talked about rugby and soccer, which was interesting because, of course, being Michel Serres and being that deep poetic soul that he was, the way that he spoke about these things was eminently and deeply philosophical. So it did end up being a philosophical discussion, but not a tell me about Michel Serres' approach to ontology or any of those things. So it's a really, for me, a deeply formative experience because I think that for me, not that we're talking about Serres today particularly, but we will riff on him a little bit. But Serres, for me, as a writer, is someone who is just so elegant in the way that he phrases things and brings you on such a wonderful drifting journey through his, I think, very complex and nuanced thought. It's someone that I would always be anchored in, no matter how far I drift from my philosophical center. Again, reading Atlan, there's a lot of relays and registers and references there that I think are very important. That's my little fractal return to my autobiography before we talk about Atlan.
I don't remember you mentioning that story, and we always encourage a little iteration in any case to remind ourselves and our listeners, even if they've heard something once before, going back over it is never a bad thing. But I don't remember that story, so it's new to me, damn it. And
The gosh darn refrain.
yeah, it's a gosh darn refrain.
Ritornello.
Yes.
There we go.
I did task you, and it doesn't have to be deep. It's just that he's a multifaceted thinker. You mentioned how he doesn't necessarily bring up a lot of thinkers with which you would assume he would be conversant. For example, every time I read him and he talks about some of these things, I always hope he's going to name drop Simondon, but he doesn't do that, and that's fine. You know, we're not going to penalize him for that. But tell us, as a means of beginning to deep dive into this thinker, tell us a little bit about Henri Atlan for our listeners.
And I did actually end up doing some of this biographical prep because one of the things I'm most interested in is where he fits, partially because of our readings, but where he fits in the genealogy of the return to Spinoza in France in the 20th century. So Martial Guéroult, Alexandre Mathurin, and their successors like Laurent Pauve and others. So beginning there, let's just talk about the uniqueness of Atlan's growth and where he came from. So he's born in Algeria, got his medical degree from the Université de Paris in 1958, doctoral studies in biophysics, got his doctorat d'état at Paris Diderot in 1973. This obviously already begins sort of the transdisciplinary notion of how his career sort of emerges. He's really interested in both empirical science and theoretical reflections and philosophical reflections on those sciences. Probably the most decisive part of his scientific formation was between 66 and 73. He was at NASA's Ames Research Center and at UC Berkeley, and he was looking at aging and mutation. And this is where he found Heinz von Förster's pioneering work on cybernetics and order from noise, which, as we know from the readings, becomes very important from his notion of noise emerging into complexity. From 70 to 73, he was at the Weizmann Institute and was working with the biophysicist Aharon Kachalski. There he started looking at the thermodynamics of irreversible phenomena. There he comes into contact with Prigogine and the work on dissipative structures. And this all comes together in his major work, which we actually did read part of, which is L'organisation biologique et la théorie de l'information. And that's where we get the complexity from noise idea. I'm just going to go through a little bit just to situate us in terms of a structure of his career in terms of early, middle, late, and current, because I think that helps us get through some of the stuff. And I don't want to spend too much time going through this rather detailed biographical quasi-essay that I did here. Early period, we taught like the 60s and 70s. This is where you got his scientific foundations, his medical training, the biophysics doctorate, the work on aging and mutation. Then we go to the middle period, where you really start to see a deepening philosophical engagement. And he gets appointed to the National Ethics Committee, and he starts working on his opposition to genetic reductionism. And then he has À tort et à raison, From Enlightenment to Enlightenment, where he develops a sort of epistemological pluralism and a dialogue as well between science and myth, which becomes incredibly important in his Talmudic readings of science and his scientific readings of the Talmud. The late period, so most of the stuff that we read, by the way, is sort of in this middle period. The late period is interesting because it's les étincelles de hasard, which is sparks of, been translated as sparks of randomness. And what you will see is this sort of like deep rereading of all those early texts into this profound sort of Talmudic environment where he talks about the Spinozist ideas, the neurobiological ideas, the determinism ideas, all the things around complexity, but becomes very embedded in Jewish scholarship. And it's fascinating to see what I'll call the nuclei of these ideas in the selected writings texts explode out into these very fulminant and fully realized reflections in the 2 volumes of Sparks of Randomness. One of the most recent things that he's written, as we're well aware of, is actually from Edinburgh University Press, and it was the course on Spinoza and contemporary biology. That just sort of gives you an idea of his arc, but it also shows you how important Spinoza is. From what I can tell, and this is where I'll stop speaking and we can go back to our dialogue, his engagement with Spinoza doesn't come until relatively late. And so it's like he finds in Spinoza this companion walker along his path. But this comprehensive naturalism without reductionism that he ends up elucidating, and what you could call an emergent naturalism, it draws so much from Spinoza. And I think he's very cognizant and acknowledging of the fact that his philosophy would not have been able to be expressed in the systematic depth and complexity that it has without that Spinozist anchor. And that's where I'll just stop talking about his trajectory and open it up.
On a whim, I translated one of his essays from 70. Well, it might have been published earlier than 79. I'd have to look at but it was collected in a 79 edition.
He's got the book.
He
Connor's
does
got a
have
copy.
the book. I see. He showed me a picture earlier. I don't know the best way, Connor, that I would translate it into English because it doesn't sound as sexy as in French, but between the crystal and smoke, between smoke and the crystal, if you wanted to reverse the order. Obviously, La Fumée can also be steam, but I was thinking more of smoke because it sounds, again, as a smoker, it sounds sexier.
I mean, I think it also goes to the Bataille connection on that.
100% to the thermodynamic notions that he's talking about too, because there's definitely heat involved here. And again, of course, steam can reference that, but there's also like an oxidative thing going on, I think, in what he's talking through.
Yeah, it's like the residue portion too, I think is important for our investigation, separate from this episode.
The reason why I picked it up and translated it was because he is discussing irreversibility in terms of time and how that's important for your studies, Coop. And I think that it's also interesting because it's something that, as a biologist and a philosopher, he's able to tackle this notion that kind of seemingly crops up throughout his work, which is the question of self-organization. And I think that he does a good job in that essay and obviously elsewhere whenever he discusses self-organization to approach these things with a scientific mind and with a conceptual philosophical mind. And he's able to do both. He's able to wear both hats, which again is why he reminds me, although their writings are very different, their conclusions and their way of approaching these questions from a conceptual and a functional or a philosophical and scientific point of view reminds me of Simondon in that sense, even as superficial as it may seem. The notion of self-organization is very interesting. And that would be, what would you say, the early middle period, or do you think that's already getting us in the middle period, Connor, in 79?
That's definitely the middle period. It's
right. Yeah, so, and I sent you a copy of that. There's some other essays in this little book, which subtitled Essay on the Organization of the Living. I think that in English, we might have to play with the between the crystal and the smoke or something. It's hard to put a definitive article behind smoke without feeling odd, but he's definitely interesting. And I know you said, Connor, that at the end of this book, he has a text where you said he tears apart Rouillet. So I would have to look up that because maybe that would be something I'll translate next. But you can already see in that essay that I sent you both, where you mentioned in passing, Connor, he is looking at self-organization in relation to things like noise. And I would love to see more about that because that caught me. And the fact that I didn't know this, Connor, maybe I misunderstood you. You kind of mentioned in passing that Michel Serres is interested or takes up the notion of, he becomes interested in noise in this deeper way because of Atlan, or at least maybe if not causatively, then at least, correlatively. I'm not sure if I misunderstood.
My understanding is that it is actually a direct riffing off some of this work, like the
Okay,
early
wow.
work,
That's great.
that is really is shifting more so interference than le parasite, but it's like that original notion of complexity from noise is so important for the way that Serre sees noise, and so there's a direct lineage from Atlan there.
We do have in this book itself, the first section, the first part of the selected writings is on self-organization, and the third essay is noise as a principle of self-organization. Just for the listener, go out and find a copy of the selected writings. I think, would you agree, Connor? That's probably a good place to start because you're going to get little cross sections of his work throughout all these different periods.
I think it is an absolutely exceptional series of essays, and I think that if one wants to like have an engagement across the entire spectrum of what Atlan is doing, you couldn't have a better starting point. And it also sets one up really well, as I mentioned earlier, for the much more difficult to read Sparks of Randomness. Sparks of Randomness is difficult to read, and partially because of that Talmudic style of having a lot of intertextual notes. But it's you'll feel
But it's a
wonderfully,
lot of fun. It's a lot of fun, but it might be
and
good
you'll
to
feel
get your
wonderfully comfortable if you start with the selected writings
Exactly.
into getting into that. It just gives you so many different anchors to go, oh, he's exploding out this notion here, he's contracting this here, and all the things that he talks about in all the essays that we specifically focused on for this episode are really there densely, particularly in volume 1, Spermatic Knowledge, but there's a couple of other riffs in The Atheism of Scripture, which is volume 2.
Sparks of Randomness, I've read through, not cover to cover, but I've read through, perused volume 1. It is fascinating, and I like that was it Cultural Memory in the Present? Is that the name of the series that it appeared in?
It is that imprint,
and that is Stanford. And they did a good job of formatting the text because, as you mentioned, the Talmudic inspiration, the way in which the footnotes are framing the text on the sides and like bordering it like a parergon, like a work of art has a frame. And the translator himself points out that he was happy with what the typographers allowed him to do. I haven't seen the French original, so I don't know if that's what it looks like in French. I would assume. If not, then he and Atlan cooked up something that makes it quite spectacular. It's something you would expect from someone like Derrida, which is interesting because you mentioned that he's born in Algeria. So like that kind of that inspiration to do the footnotes that way makes Sparks of Randomness a different feel because the footnotes don't necessarily feel like they're outside the text, as one might say, right? They really are framing it and informing it. And so, yeah, I would say after selected writings, then one is well equipped to go and look at. By the way, and some of the pieces from Sparks of Randomness are in this volume as well. Wasn't the Golems essay from that work? And we see some other pieces like, I would wonder if all of the texts from 1999 and the selected writings are not themselves from that volume 1.
You're absolutely right. There are a number of selections that are drawn from at least the first volume, but this obviously preceded Len Schramm's translation,
Yes.
and it does not adopt that Talmudic intertextual form. So you end up with basically the primary text and not what I'll call the glossographic text.
That's a good way to put it. That's good. He actually does have a number of essays that have already been published in English. So if you're smart at using Sci-Hub and the DOI.org numbers, you can grab a couple of them. I just grabbed one on a formal definition of organization. So he has appeared even outside of the main work. Some of his pieces have appeared, and this one looks like it's using scientific notation and a lot of equations and stuff. So it's maybe for a nerdier audience, but I bet looking through it, there'd be some gems in there outside of the more scientific exposition. In any case, I will pause there. I just think that the notion of self-organization that he seems to come back to throughout his life and re-enrich is important. But Coop, I know that you have been inspired and multiplied, as those in Guattari might say, by Atlan's work. So do you have an initial response before we go deeper?
I don't know if I have anything to add to what you guys have both discussed. I'm pretty much ready to jump into.
I meant your initial response to his work, not to
Oh,
what
gotcha.
he and that's what I guess your initial response to Atlan himself, his work. That's what I meant. I apologize.
Gotcha. Oh, no worries. He offers a more grounded theoretical space, and I think that's going to be super useful for the book project to kind of give some real meat, some real like terrestrial and ground to that. So I'm really glad that you guys together helped to make that little contribution. I don't have much to say on that topic. I'd like to just kind of dive right into.
Well, before we move on, one thing that's ironic, Coop, is even before I think, or maybe obviously you had these ideas percolating and permeating your mind and soul, but before you had announced to me that you were starting on down this road of a book project, it was a couple months ago, right? That I kind of brought up, hey, we should do something with Conor. We should do some Atlan. It was just kind of left field. And so it's nice that it still, just like a lot of the projects we take up, Coop, that seemingly are whimsical or unconscious, involuntary, they're obviously still informed by a kind of line that connects the interests.
So I think I want to first start out with, I think I even mentioned this, I'm not 100% sure. It might have just been because we've been talking about doing this episode for a while that predates the book even. I want to say that I used this quote from Dune in that, or whenever we looked at Spinoza's Ethics, I think the first part. I'm going to go ahead and read this. This is, and just to highlight a couple of things. One, I want to really mobilize Herbert as a co-theorist and show that he is thinking about these same questions. And this is a tack that I want to illustrate throughout the development of the book arguments that we're working on together. And also, I want to like put a note in there for the audience that this quote goes to what I think would be an immanent causality. Keep that in mind whenever we're working through this. I've got two other quotes that I want to work through, but we'll do this one first. When God hath ordained a creature to die in a particular place, he causes that creature's wants to direct him to that place. The context of this is the Fremen, who are obviously, they're hardened desert people, they're survivors, they're people who don't make a distinguishing line or draw a distinguishing line between fate and desire. Obviously, we want to subtract the transcendence here and just make desire the operative, working from inside the creature or the subject or whatever, however you want to label that. So I just think that's a really interesting, I don't know, when I was reading the Spinoza, this quote just crept into my head out of thin air or smoke, if you will. But I don't know if either of you want to pick up anything from that immediately or if we should roll to the next one, but I'll stop and pause for you both.
Well, this might be a funny way of diagonalizing the argument that Spinoza makes that we don't have free will. If that quote already is a harbinger for the sort of fate that we're after, that's where I would think about going.
Goes towards how I've always considered and determined in the last instance as well. My intuition was always there's a tie between immanence and in the last instance. Or if pull me over, Taylor, if I'm fucking up, because I always want to mix up the terminology. To me, even as a novice, when I'm reading this, that was always the sort of connection that I was trying to make. The creature's wants are determined. This particular creature's wants and desires are determined because they emerge from a particular confluence of flows of debt, whether that be linguistic, cultural, familial, economic, yada, yada, right? Like there's a million different flows that coalesce into a subject that can service those debts in a particular instantiation at a particular time, right? So it's like the structure of desire is in place. So that sort of the relational endpoints in a way are kind of predetermined, although those aren't necessarily static, right? There's a negotiation between two polarities, let's say. So those aren't necessarily fixed in a super deterministic way, but in a certain sense, you're caught in between this sort of flow of equilibriums or tensions or war or conflict between things. I think Atlan would probably be more at home saying like a direct conflict between these oppositional frames or polarities. And so whatever the specific wants that the creature has that direct it are contingent, and those are historically contingent based on all the other accumulations of the debts that accrue over history. And sort of really those flows are kind of what constitutively make the subject or creature or what have you. I'm being very loose there, so please. But anyways, I don't know if either of you have anything to pick up
I
from there.
love this quote, and I think you're dead on. For starters, I think that it's a good read of Spinoza, and I think it's a good read of Atlan. And part of the reason why is what Zaraj calls Spinoza's paradoxical conservatism. This is that sort of like it is. There is no outsideness that is projected by this quote, so I don't think there's any transcendence there. I think that theos that's in there is an internal directedness, and I think that there is a deep determinism here that riffs with both Atlan's take on Spinoza and Spinoza himself. I have a quote here that I just want to riff off here, which talks a little bit, not oppositionally, but comparatively, and it's from Roger Mounier. And I feel like it just, the framing of it is very similar. Even for the creature who inhabits it, the open is not truly the breast which welcomes. Rather, the open pulls away into a movement of exodus, which is the very one of the continuum which dispossesses. As the open, it rules in this movement of uprooting and absence, consuming everything when it is ripe into the emptiness of a dimension which clears away appearance in the proper sense, stretching it out to the limits of the visible, and, as it were, making it vanish. And I think that that's, to my mind, similar to tracks left in the sand, slow burying over, and slow disappearance, but a disappearance that still accepts the possibility of abiron and the open. I just think there's an interesting conjuncture there.
I just actually thought of this while you were talking. And Taylor, you might really pick up on this in the context of the book project. So if we look at God and we take that notion, and if we look at that from the kind of Feuerbachian, Marxian lens of the critique of God as the collective, that would point to the debt, the kind of inherited debt of familial, economic, biological. In a way, like this kind of points to what I was arguing in the sense of, like, if we want to substitute, I don't know, God out for this historically contingent set of debt relations or flows or what have you, right? Like that would sort of, it's interesting, I think, that Marx and Feuerbach kind of really point already to my arguments in the book relative to like dead labor and this kind of historical accumulation of that determines us. So in a way, there is a God in the kind of Leibnizian and a kind of like reverse Leibnizian lens that is determining us in a right that is kind of like the apparently transcendental cause.
I mean, I was thinking about a passage from Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where this is part 5, where Freud is talking about, I won't go into exactly what he says, but he talks about these detours that life makes the organism go through before reaching its aim of death. And his point being that he kind of sums all of this up, this paradoxical situation of the life and death drives. He kind of sums it all up in saying that the organism wants to die, but not immediately, but it wants to die in its own way, in this way that's immanent to it. And that's kind of his point. So the wanting has to be really like, we got to put that in brackets, because it's not a direct wish to go straight into the inanimate, but in its own time, in its own way, something immanent to its organization to unfold the path, the detours toward death. And so that would be, instead of where or even when, it would be how, to riff off of your Herbert quote.
Yeah, I'm glad you astutely brought that up. That's kind of where I was going to jump to next, was the detour taken supposedly by the life drive, as Freud kind of postulates. I think that's interesting in the context of Eros and Thanatos as well, just more broadly, and what I call the suicidal wager of reproduction. But I don't know. Maybe I'll wait to contextualize that unless either of you want me to follow up or riff on that kind of notion of the imminent death.
Maybe this is jumping ahead, and maybe it could work with your initial quote, or further quotes would be Conor, you kind of nicely were like, hey, what if we bring in some of the stuff on the golem that could be slotted in here in these discussions of life and death, this question of creating life, of course.
Ooh, that's good. I didn't even see that. Nice.
Whether in the mythical sense or in the literary fictional sense, because obviously Dr. Frankenstein gets brought up along the way in this essay. I just wanted to bring that up in case you had, and obviously, Coop, you can continue in a second. I was just thinking, Conor, you're the one that wanted us to bring this in to sort of add into the mix. Did you have any thoughts about this essay that made you want to sort of add it into our reading today?
Number one is the Gola register for
yes.
Coop in part, but also is the notion of the golem as some sort of simulacrum. And this notion of the artifice and the artificiating of life, which I think is incredibly important. And it sort of spins off into a couple of different things that I'm looking at in terms of where Atlan deals with time and eternity, how he tackles finitude, and also how he tackles excess. And that's where a lot of the thinkers that I was discussing with you just before we started would be in very fertile dialogue with Atlan, were Atlan in dialogue with anyone, which he does not seem to be particularly in the philosophical community, whether it be phenomenological, post-phenomenological, deconstructive, or what have you.
He felt pretty, in that one essay on immanent causality, his philosophical interlocutors were more from what we call the analytic school, right? I mean, he brings up Hans Jonas, he brings up Davidson, Donaldson, Hilary Putnam, all of these that might not necessarily be interlocutors for those on the other side of the divide at the continental sphere. So it's interesting that he restricts his remarks on probably the densest essay he has on Spinoza to these thinkers that we might see in more of the British American side of philosophy.
And his read of Putnam and Davidson is top notch as well, I will say. I think that essay is a trenchant analysis of some of the parallelism that he's getting at, and a very good and charitable deconstruction of anomalous monism as proposed by Davidson.
Crazy coincidence, Conor, that you bring up simulacrum, because I was thinking too that the golem would be like the third order simulacrum. The inscription that animates the gola doesn't imitate or produce copies, but it simulates a life, which kind of goes, I think, to the kind of way that I was talking about these flows of debt and inscription that I didn't go into how the body is marked to kind of draw from Anti-Oedipus, but I think you can kind of make that logical leap to think the body itself or the subject or the creature, I don't know, like I'll be very loose there, please. I don't want Taylor to pull me over for being sloppy, but whatever that creature or thing is certainly animated in a series of languages that the operative code that in a way functions, right? Like prices, credit scores, like all of these kind of things that are inscribed on the body in the kind of modern sense. That situation sort of animates the desires and so forth that we struggle for, or just wanted to highlight that as a cool coincidence.
The golem thought as well, and particularly in that essay, really does outline and emphasize that primal and primordial question of what is the living, particularly when he's talking about the Talmudic stories about the golem and the fact that there is a almost indistinguishability. And in fact, in one of the stories, there's a resurrection, which is, a recreation of man through a, bringing back from the dead. So again, that's, to talk about the Tleilaxu idea there. But it is the notion that the parameters of the living are never as predetermined or preformed as we would hope they are. And I think that, again, it's back to his famous quote from, who is it? The notion that there is no such thing as the living. It's a very difficult to define thing. And Taylor, this is where I find it extremely unusual, bizarre that he does not engage with Simondon at all, because all of the wonderful concepts that Simondon brings up through pre-individuation of challenging the notion of ontology, they fit, I think, very well, and they would actually bolster Atlan's ontogenetic approach, but it's just not there. And it's just a pollination that really, I think, warrants happening.
Yeah, and I do think that it's cool, Coop, that the end of the essay on the golem comes back to what I was telling you about, where he says, golem time, unlike the time of human life, is reversible, just like the fully deterministic time of mathematical physics. By contrast, when randomness is introduced into a machine, when the determinism is no longer totally controlled, time becomes irreversible. This is the kind of time we experience in our lives. So even in the golem essay, which might seem far removed from his thoughts on self-organization and reversibility, irreversibility, he still is able to weave it in and shows that that's one of his that's one of his refrains, right? That's one of the things that he's, I don't want to say obsessed with, but not pejoratively, right? That he has a preoccupation, let's say, with these ideas. Less of a Herbert fanatic that I naively forgot about the Gola. Why are we reading about golems? Oh, no shit. Right. Okay. Yes. Duncan. Okay. Got it.
So what's interesting there too, back to Baudrillard, is in chapter 6 of Symbolic Exchange and Death, where he, as in Baudrillard, which is kind of interesting that there's some like Baudrillard's riffing in a very loose way, but he's not far off, surprisingly, in that he talks about Adonai as the name of God. And it's kind of like riffing on this kind of joke that DNA, like DNA being the anagram and DNA being this. And I think that goes directly to the kind of Tleilaxu process of Gola creation, because they use the actual, I don't think Herbert actually, like, he says flesh or some shit. He doesn't say DNA specifically, but the implication, I think, is clear there. So I just wanted to draw that connection.
Also for Coop and for the listeners, as Conor knows, in French, DNA is ADN. That's why Adonai is played off of, and it works better in French than in English.
I want to move to my second quote. This is from God Emperor of Dune. This is Leto 2. Just to contextualize a few things to ruminate on for both you guys and the audience would be, one, Leto's project of the Golden Path is to sort of become the last instance of last instances. And he's also, I think, taking on maybe the determination of being the immanent cause in a certain way. But just to footnote that for further discussion, let me go ahead and read this, because I don't know that this exactly comes into play with this quote, but I just wanted to mention that briefly. But the closer he came to being a sandworm, the harder he found it to make decisions which others would call inhuman. Once he had done it with ease. As his humanity slipped away, though, he found himself filled with more and more human concerns. Leto as the man who becomes systems, the man who sees all futures, who embodies determination itself. And this doesn't lead to freedom. It actually leads to more slavery, more constraint, not less. I'll just pause there and let either of you pick up if you want to.
This is, I think, hugely interesting. And it is actually, I think, an essay or a book that you guys have gone through, which is Lyotard on the Inhuman. And I think both senses that Lyotard brings up in that book of the Inhuman, which is systems compressing things, but also the inhuman sort of being, I think, probably similar to the pre-individual in terms of it expressing the potential to be. I think that actually is an interesting nexus with what's happening to Leto in the becoming worm, becoming sandworm type of trajectory, or that line of flight. Just wanted to mention that there, because Taylor, I know that you're conversant with that book, and just wondering if you have any thoughts about Lyotard on the Inhuman.
We haven't looked at it yet, but I think it's one we want to,
now,
for sure.
That would be something where if I were to immediately connect it to, was it the last essay in the Spinoza? Let me look it back. Instead of delving into what I wish I had a good idea about, this is 245. So this is knowledge, glory, and human dignity, and on human dignity. Atlan is able to draw on the question of the humane versus the human. Correct me if I'm wrong, Conor. Do the French only have the one word, and do they just have the word? Whereas I think he even points it out, English language has a far wider range, because I don't think they have the word humane. I think it's only from context.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
That's absolutely correct. So that non-human, inhuman, human, and humane register requires contextualization to
yes,
have any semiotic portent in front.
exactly. So off the top of my head, Connor, I don't have a good response to you about Lyotard's book on the inhuman. That's something that it's been too long and my brain is blanking. Now, if you can jump in with something, I will not restrict you, but I can't think off the top of my head of Lyotard, that work in particular. But I just thought that as a way of tying it back into Atlan, it's kind of interesting. He's bringing up, and this is in the context of human cloning and something that I didn't know, Connor, and I wonder if he was still on this committee, this council of ethics. Was it 97? I think that France reversed course about cloning. And it was that ethics committee that basically the way it works, Coop, and I'm also speaking to the audience and I'm trying to figure it out myself because I only know the broad outlines. This ethics committee in 97 is responsible for reversing course on some laws that were established as late as 1990. So 7 years later, they're revisiting this question of cloning. Now, this isn't just reproductive cloning, by the way. This is also the cloning of stem cells, non-reproductive cloning. And so in 97, they issued two different reports, if you will, to the president of the republic, to the French president. It basically has, if you want, it doesn't immediately have the force of law, but it becomes embedded in French jurisprudence. And so they reverse course on the banning of the cloning of stem cells because they hold it to have all kinds of great potentials. Even another 30 years out, we kind of know that that's become a commonplace. So non-reproductive cloning, this council, this ethics committee is like non-reproductive cloning, good, but reproductive cloning, bad. And one of the things that they center around is what Atlan is discussing in this essay, which is the sort of universal acknowledgement of human dignity and how reproductive cloning of the human would instrumentalize the human being, etc. And it's funny enough, Connor, the piece I translated by Thibaut Cornillot, where he takes this up without necessarily saying, yeah, let's clone human beings, but he says this is a crock of shit. Let's think about the plot of, even in recent history, not only slaves, but the working class. And so this notion of instrumentalizing human beings, that's what capitalism does every fucking day. And this notion of human dignity is something that's also laughable because we see all around us the way in which we flout that precept every day.
The illusion of the rights-based international order, for example.
Exactly. So I think that this essay, and again, I think that doesn't he have a section, or is the subtitle, maybe it's not a section, but I feel like he discusses it openly as just like maybe it was another piece, but he kind of says the for and against of the pros and contras of reproducing human clones. I don't know if he was still on this council by the time of 97. Obviously, this text is written in 2007, so that'd be another 10 years later. This notion of, because he says he's talking about ethical demarcations. This is 245, and first full paragraph at the bottom. It leads us to rate certain practices as not acceptable, such as reproductive human cloning or experimentation on human subjects without consent or other, which is something we've done in the history of science, not just the Nazis, or other treatments considered inhuman, such as torture or slavery. These we disqualify on moral grounds as being contrary to essential human dignity. Without all of what he said, without even going deeper into his point, all of that frames in microcosm what the two reports given by this French ethics committee to the president are about. And I think that Thibaut Cornillot is more willing, I think, to call out the hypocrisy and being cool with one type of reproduction, cloning, but not cool with the other one, because all the things that are used to sort of safeguard us from cloning humans reproductively, he finds to be quite shallow. It's just very flimsy liberal talking points if you want to like be cynical about it, which I am.
I think it's also deeply dissonant with his very solid arguments against genetic reductionism.
Yes.
And the notion that there is some capacity to some sort of Laplacian solve for what constitutes a individuated human being, and that can somehow be replicated, which all of his research, whether it be complexity, noise, anti-genetic reductionism, is clearly a deep refutal of or rebuttal of. For him to consider this sort of as a cutoff point, as you're saying, seems to be a very aleatory line in the sand, which really is not supported by the rest of his argumentation. And that notion again of the inhuman, I think, is important to discuss that dividing line. Just to go back to the Lyotard for a sec to see if this does anything for you or for Coop. When Lyotard is talking about the inhuman in that book, he has what I'll call two registers. One is compression, which is the systematic, and it's sort of the capture of what it is to be by information. So it's enclosed. The other is what Lyotard is talking about as an infancy, which is, again, this milieu, which, due to being a body or for the capacity for suffering, cannot be captured exclusively by information. So it's almost like an anti-cybernesis of human ontology or ontogenesis. And that's where I think there's an interesting comparison with Atlan, because I still don't really quite understand what Atlan does with excess and with saturation. So, and that again, of course, is why I'm interested in, Jean-Luc Marion in dialogue with him as well. Just curious if that compression accession thing, in terms of what the inhuman can represent, brings anything to you.
What was it that you were showing me yesterday, Coop? You were mentioning Doom Patrol and you had that quote, and I don't remember where it was from, about the inhuman and the human.
Oh, you're talking about
do
the
you remember?
animal, vegetable, mineral?
Yeah.
I have it in the notes here somewhere. It'll be easy to draw because it's, and I don't recall which essay this is from, but I'll go ahead and read this. This is Outlawn, actually. Let us immediately recognize that in all times inhumanity has characterized the human species. In fact, only human beings can be inhuman or experience the inhuman. Mineral, vegetal, and animal existence can only ever be assigned to the non-human. It is precisely because science and technology are among the most characteristic spheres of human activity that the everlasting question arises whether their products are human or inhuman. And so there's a character in Doom Patrol, animal, vegetable, mineral man, who I might have to link to this, but there's like a funny, he's like half, or he's not half, but he's like a fucking raptor, half, and another piece of him is man, another piece is vegetable, and then rock. And they actually,
he's a chimera.
and there's actually
there's like a viral chimera, right?
And that's on page 244, Coop, of that essay I mentioned, the knowledge, glory, and human dignity. And
hilarious coincidence that popped up.
Well, that's good. I mean, that makes sense. That's why when Conor brought up the inhuman, I immediately thought of that final essay in the Spinoza section. And I guess to go back to your point, Conor, about compression and expression, not expression, excessence, something that exceeds. What's interesting, and I don't have a good enough way of I can only riff off and jump off, but Coop and I have been talking more and more about entropy and negentropy, right? And so on the one hand, living systems, as they age and begin to die, we obviously have the products of entropy, which accords with the second law of thermodynamics, the heat death, right? That type of increasing stability. I don't want to say disorganization, because in fact, dead systems are the most organized if you think about it. But as a product, though, of individuation, as Simondon says, right, there's not just entropy created in this move towards stability out of metastability, but there's also information creation, which would be negentropy, at least a form of it. And so I think that that's something, when you brought up information, I think that that's another way of looking at the creative aspect. And as you know, Simondon is going to want to look at information as the way in which we can sort of navigate between systems of individuation. He finds it to be an essential component and not something that's just like a byproduct. That's kind of where I think maybe there's a through line there between your bringing up of Lyotard and then Atlan and Simondon in terms of self-organizing systems, vital individuation.
That's perfect. And I think that there's a sort of interesting, not dialectical tension, but there's a tension there between information and or noise as apparatus of capture and information and or noise as line of flight.
That's good. Yeah.
I think if you want to illustrate that through Dune again, to belabor the point as I like to do, the worm sign that alerts the Fremen to the presence of the worm, the spice blow, like these are quote unquote inhuman signs that the Fremen they read the signs as part of their individuation as a culture, right? And they incorporate that into the communication between the two different, I don't know what Simondon refers to them, but right, it's where two different milieus sort of meet one another and exchange in a certain way. I don't know if you want to pick that up at all, Taylor, or if you would like me to move to my next quote.
I mean,
or if I totally botched that, please.
No, I would just say instead of talking about milieus meeting, which is a different type of, I was thinking of more in terms of what Conor said about lines of flight. I was thinking about the way in which when Deleuze and Guattari are talking about stratification, they always talk about pairs, and the pairs themselves comes in pairs. So you got the epistrata and the peristrata, and there's a flowering out of these coupling systems, right? And amidst all of this, one side of the assemblage is facing the strata, the other side is facing the body without organs, which would be the line of flight, the deterritorialized, etc. That was what I was thinking immediately.
Just to go back to a second to the genetic reductionism as well, one of the things that I just want to bring up before I forget it is the impossibility of there being an absolute surface of what would be the definition of the human ontology. And I think that that's sort of a Reyerian entry into what Atlan's saying about the dead end of genetic reductionism.
The third quote I wanted to mobilize today is from Children of Dune. This is an epigraph, and I think these epigraphs, particularly in Children of Dune, are this is where the meat of the philosophical investigation or work that Herbert does, a lot of it is in these epigraphs. And in particular, Children just has to me the best epigraphs throughout the whole series, although there are some gems throughout, but let me go ahead and read this. The assumption that humans exist within an essentially impermanent universe, taken as an operational precept, demands that the intellect become a totally aware balancing instrument. But the intellect cannot react thus without involving the entire organism. Such an organism may be recognized by its burning, driving behavior. And thus it is with a society treated as organism. But here we encounter an old inertia. Societies move to the goading of ancient reactive impulses. They demand permanence. Any attempt to display the universe of impermanence arouses rejection patterns, fear, anger, and despair. Then how do we explain the acceptance of prescience? Simply, the giver of prescient visions, because he speaks of an absolute or permanent realization, may be greeted with joy by humankind even while predicting the most dire events. So I'll let that marinate, and if either of you have something you want to pick up there, please feel free.
I'll just say that is it's interesting because I think that is really where Herbert's deep influence by Zen Buddhism is coming in. So that's sort of like a permanent state of satori in a way, right? That's just a guess, but it's a really interesting quote.
Taylor, I think interesting here for the book arguments is societies move to the goading of ancient reactive impulses. They demand permanence. There's an implication of marking, of being able to identify and capture and mark and classify. That is a necessary function of capitalism, right? Capitalism needs to mark us. But there are also the threat of the inherited id, which I think would be the goading of the ancient and the reactive impulses, the return of the repressed and all that. I don't know if you want to pick up there. I'm happy to move on if you want.
Very quickly, I think that there's another interesting thing there, Coop, in terms of apoptosis versus necrosis or oncogenic growth, because what you're talking about there is sort of that ability a little bit later on about facing catastrophe. If catastrophe comes in a topology or a shape that we're able to recognize it in, it becomes embraceable. So it's almost like it is an algorithmic crisis. That's something that is predictable, or it has a predetermined volume or whatever you want to call it. Whereas the truly anomie type of catastrophe, or the anarchic catastrophe, which really pulls the rug out from under ontogenesis, I think is a different sort of path. And I think that where is where you see that resistance, and where the shape of a society, of an individual, of whatever it might be, argues with its environment to retain its boundaries and whatever shape that it's currently in.
Yeah, I like that. I was sort of going to go there, where the question about society's demand permanence, I wonder, that to me gets back to the stuff that I always tell you about, the institutional death drive kind of stuff.
What about anxiety? If we can identify the threat, we can then it becomes a symptom or something like that. I'm just kind of thinking on the fly there. But I was thinking about, right, like if it's the unknown, unmarked black swan event, there's no defense. But if we can sort of see the threat coming, then we can be anxious about it, or we can defend ourselves against it if we can identify it. Or I don't know. I'm just
I think that's why you're bringing up marking, because what is it that Deleuze and Guattari say that the primitive territory machine is most terrified of? It's the uncoded flows, that which would escape all coding. This is why they experience the threat of and unconsciously ward it off, because it's precisely the conquest, the victory of decoded flows. That's the nightmare.
I think there's also the tension, though, with capitalism and marking, or really debt relations, broadly speaking, and marking, because capitalism, by decoding the flows and then putting a price of exchange across every domain of activity, expanding into things that once in the primitive territorial machine were not necessarily a priced economic relation. Like there may have been a more abstract thing going on there in terms of exchange. These things that were exempt from an exchange at a price then become priced into the whole thing, right? Like it's got to expand its territory and price more and more things on this sort of commodity relationship of exchange versus the sublime, right? Like kind of the exchange of the Bataille talks about in the Akirshir, where the prisoner of war, right? Like they achieve a certain sublimation as a sacrifice versus the Roman slave that becomes this instrument of time accumulation for the slave master.
I'd also say, too, just riffing there on capitalism for a second, for that perspective, I see capitalism, at least in that register, as being in a asymptotic courtly love style relationship with its own suicide. So it wants to die, but wants to endlessly put off the execution.
Yeah, I think that's the gradient, right?
And it refuses to end. Yeah, that's desire in that pathological canalization.
You're absolutely onto something. This is something I work through in the book, in the sense of the way that I suppose you would look at fertility rates dropping across the globe. So a lot of the arguments are that, it's tied to advanced economies, but it also does apply to if you look at the numbers, I think Bangladesh, India, these areas, while they may not be as economically developed, they are still integrated to some degree, and they're still being impacted by this web of relations that is making the suicidal wager of reproduction kind of unbearable and untenable, which capitalism needs to thrive, right?
Yeah, and it's consumption that refuses that consummation. It's desperately feared of its own little death.
Brilliant. Because I don't know if you were aware, but one of the theoretical mechanisms that we came up with was petit mort a. So to riff on objet a, to riff on amortization from Simondon, and then obviously the little death of the orgasm as part of the suicidal wager of reproduction.
And it's a good way to think about debt horizons and debt ceilings as well.
We shouldn't forget that in the background, what Conor was bringing up was at the end of chapter 1 of Symbolic Exchange and Death, when Baudrillard is able to talk about death deferred, right? And that's how he defines labor.
Yeah, that's the tie back to the Aztecs and the Roman slavery that I referenced in kind of the battalion thing.
We can return to this later, but it is interesting to think about that in terms of where is Atlan on sacrifice, for example? I'm not sure, but there is, again, that notion of the conservation that I alluded to earlier in terms of being a process, which always sort of tries to enclose and capture things like noise. And it obviously allows for complexity to emerge from it, but it doesn't, I think, allow for the outsideness of something that it eludes capture at the end of the day. Now, I may be misreading Atlan on this point, but it's where I see some of these other thinkers really sort of being able to integrate with him in a very useful way, including Catherine Malabou. And I think the notion of destructive plasticity, I think, is a really important one to sort of jam in here in terms of the way that this very Spinozist approach to the cycle of things that Atlan is using.
Oh, that makes me think about, I was going to bring this up later, but the marking issue is something that Herbert wrestles with in the context of the golden path, and particularly in the development of what does he call it? The no gene or something. So his kind of like breeding, his like project of breeding and genetic manipulation is to create a humanity that has a gene that prevents them from being recognized and captured by other prescient beings, having them escape that sort of mechanism of capture, which would, I think, Siona would be kind of a noise in a way that couldn't be incorporated or something like that. She can't be sort of, I don't know if it's noise, but anyway, I think it's important that Herbert is kind of thinking along these lines, even though it's from a totally different perspective. I don't know, it's fascinating to see the convergence of thought arise. If no one else has anything, I'll pick up on my next points here. I wanted to recapitulate on the 3 quotes. The first, wanting and being determined aren't opposed. Desire would be how determination feels from the inside. I think I referenced that earlier. The second quote, fully becoming the determining force doesn't free you. It only traps you more completely. We see that play out in the narrative of Dune Messiah very intimately, which makes it a beautiful tragedy. The third quote, we demand permanence so desperately that we prefer prescient disaster to genuine uncertainty. We'd rather know that the apocalypse is coming than live without guarantees. This also made me think about the Nietzsche quote from Genealogy of Morals that man would rather will nothingness than not will at all. So between these 3 quotes, a question develops. What happens when a system so completely shapes desires that subjects want to destroy them, which also recalled the hold me tight and spit on me line from Lyotard. So
I'm not sure if Atlan brings up this in the text we read. Actually, maybe he does in passing, where he is mentioning in part 5, and he's quoting Spinoza here. This is proposition 39 of part 5. He who has a body capable of many things has a mind of which the greater part is eternal. And I think that is where obviously some people, and I think Atlan is skeptical of this reading, but some have argued, right, that Spinoza is sort of imagining, if you will, something like I don't want to call it a life after death. That seems so vulgar. But I mean, Simondon does something similar with his theory of the moral act in the conclusion to Ilfi, where he is thinking about the moral act is always able to be picked up and resonate with further future moral acts. So in that sense, there's a kind of Spinoza's eternity to the moral act. It can always reticulate and branch out and resonate throughout time, even if. And he also says interesting things about how the death of the individual is not some sort of pure absence. It still resonates throughout. And I'm using that term loosely, not in the way he uses it, but it can still reverberate, echo throughout time. So there's no sense in which there is like an absolute absence that would then not, that would be a nothingness. There is a something, and he is trying to theorize not just against the immortality of beings and why that doesn't make sense insofar as individuals can only be understood in their co-production with the milieu of which they are necessarily a part. But so no immortality of beings, but a sort of perpetual reverberation of acts.
like amortization in the positive sense, right? Like the knowledge, the information that gets generated.
Something like that. Yeah. I mean, I think that's where I would go with reading this this potential immortality or eternity in Spinoza's sense about the greater part of the mind is eternal. I would kind of read that in the Simondonian sense, rather than just disembodied spirits floating in a heavenly ether, which we know would be way too anthropocentric and imagistic for Spinoza's taste.
Think about in the context of the Duncan Idaho Gola, the series of Golas that are not the same. Well, right, it's not the same substance per se, but there's a continuation. Even though each individual dies, there's a certain continuation. So I don't know if you would say that Duncan Idaho is immortal and mortal at the same time, like he's both. That's an interesting context for what you were going over. I don't know if you guys agree.
It's difference of repetition, man.
It absolutely feels eminently Spinozist as well to think about that notion of eternity being that fragment that is eternal, no matter how imminent and limited the instantiation of a given being is at a time. Do you guys mind if I read a little quote from the end of it's actually on time, and I think it sort of encapsulates some of the stuff that you were both talking about there. It's outside of our reading purview, but it's from the No One Knows What a Body Can Do from Spermatic Knowledge. It's a little bit long, but I think it's important, and I'll just give it a whirl if that's okay. Starting with a quote from Ecclesiastes, he has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also put world time, olam, into the minds of men so that they cannot find out what Elohim has done from the beginning to the end. It is this sense of time, of the world as temporality, that Elohim has placed in our minds, and that prevents us from knowing his works under the aspect of eternity, from the beginning to the end. It is this sense of time, too, that makes us believe our own efforts can determine the future. This is what Ecclesiastes, the wise King Solomon, understood in the evening of his life when he reflected on the nature of the business that Elohim has given the sons of man to engage in. This business is precisely to lead our lives in time while acting in view of a future we think we determine. This is why, implanting the sense of time in us, Elohim has made it so in order that men should fear him. The human condition, compounded of the sense of time, fear of the unknown future, and the belief that our actions determine this future, is a bad business that Elohim has given the sons of man to engage in. In other words, we are tested by this bad business in which we are engaged, even though, because of the time-based perspective that is our lot, we can never discover what this business is absolutely and from all eternity. That is, what Elohim has done from the beginning to the end. It is still the same old alilach, the same fraud that victimizes us as moral subjects who can choose in time and are held accountable for the effects of our choices. But the wise person can at least discover the truth, although it does not modify in the slightest his ultimate lot, which remains death and, like the beast, to return to dust.
I could pick up here just to switch gears a little bit. Well, not really switching gears, but if you want to think this in the context of what we were just discussing regarding difference in repetition and the Gola, and I guess Duncan specifically, in 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari have this equation, pluralism equals monism. Not to argue that they're compatible per se, but the only coherent monism being something that would produce difference from within itself. I was reading Deleuze and Guattari alongside Atlan here, and I kind of jokingly thought chaos equals determinism. Like this would be a shit post that I would have posted on Twitter back when I had an active account. But I think that actually there's more to it than that. Like there's actually some juice there. I think popularly, right, like chaos is what escapes determinism or determination, and determinism is what excludes chaos. How can those be equal per se? I don't know if you guys want to pick up on that riff at all. I could move
it's an
on.
elegant capture. Yeah, I think it's an elegant capture of dissipative systems, to be honest. And I think that, like, if you look at the tradition that Atlan is working in, with folks like Yves Palmot and Ilya Prigogine, Isabel Stengers, and others, I think that there is. I know that that's it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek equivalence, but I think that there's an absolute, not an identity, but an equivalence in the mathematical sense between those two.
The easy reading is chaos is just epistemic, our ignorance. Like we don't see the underlying order. If we knew all the variables, this is kind of the Spinozist idea of what the adequate idea is. Like if we just had access, we could see like God's divine plan or something like that if we're thinking in terms of like Leibniz. But that's not the claim here. The claim, and I think what Atlan is saying here, is that chaos is real. It's not this apparent chaos. Like there is a consequence that actually takes place, which to me immediately went to this idea of the Amtal in Dune, which I think also was reflected, although not specifically in the text, but the Gom-Jabbar test, right? Where they hold the needle, the poison needle at Paul's neck and put his hand in the device that simulates burning. The test would only work if the stakes are real, right? If Paul was aware the box wouldn't destroy his hand, if he knew that it was a bluff, the test doesn't actually reveal anything. So the Amtal, the Gom-Jabbar test actually makes sure that the stakes are there. Like it's the pushing the thing to its limits to see what it is. So Atlan's self-organization argument would be systems don't tolerate noise. They require it in order to add complexity or increase complexity. But the noise itself has to be something that's actually real, like it's actually genuine. It's not this apparent noise that at a wider perspective or a wider use of knowledge that you'd be able to just say, oh, okay, that's not noise. That's actually harmony in the system. You're just too, your limited perspective can't perceive it.
Which almost would be the Shannon approach. But you're right. It's a non-privative notion of noise, a non-absenting notion of noise. It's not just not a signal. And the same thing with chaos in this particular context. It's not an absence of order. It has its ens causa sui, sort of like self-subsistence. And I think that that's important.
I think you could argue that the Amtal, which is like kind of the Fremen idea, literally means like chopping something off, making a cut. So this would even apply, I think, to most analysis would be like, we have to make a cut somewhere, right? Because we can't stand outside the flow of the process and observe it. So we have to make a bracketed claim. We have to make a wager. The Amtal is like a technology that, let's say, the Fremen or even the Bene Gesserit develop as a kind of species level organization. Gom-Jabbar would be how they introduce chaos into the system and test what's going to reorganize at a higher level. Paul passes the Gom-Jabbar because he doesn't avoid the chaos. He doesn't avoid the wager itself. He integrates it. He holds its hand in there in the box, in the pain box, and lets it reorganize him rather than just react to it. Like they quote in the text, it's like an animal would pull its hand out of the box. So he doesn't do that. He doesn't have that animal reaction. So he actually exceeds the test. He's the Kwisatz Haderach, the one who can be many places at once. He survives the Amtal, transcends the frame that it's posed in. So I don't know if either of you guys want to riff on that stuff or move to something else.
I mean, my thing was when you brought up pluralism equals monism, I mean, it's obviously a Spinoza's formula. It's a formula about dualism. Insofar as there is dualism, it's actually it's not that there are two substances, right? As we know, that's the monism, right? So the dualism is about the two attributes of which we know there is one and the same substance, right? So insofar as they are set of substance, thought and extension are the same or set of the same substance, which is why if being is heterogeneous and multiple, it comes to the same thing to say that being is obviously of the two we know, dual in the sense of thought and extension, but insofar as it is God has infinite attributes, substance is infinite in kind in terms of attributes, then it's obviously plural. And so pluralism is said of the one substance. And I would just say that, so the notion of dualism gets scrapped because we know throughout 1,000 Plateaus, they will move through a number of provisional dualisms, only in the end to come back to a kind of monism, which is why there is no dualism, properly speaking, but a pluralism. All of this is a way of exemplifying rhizome, which is about heterogeneity, singularity, connection, and it's a way of revamping the univocity and immanence equation. So this is Deleuze's like revamping of this initial ontological argument that he's taking up from Spinoza and trying to now have heterogeneity, pluralism, not only said of substance or centering substance, which is what he criticizes Spinoza for and why he sees Nietzsche as culminating the history of univocity. But now pluralism is said of beings of the modes, which is why you could substitute pluralism equals monism with being equals multiple, except now we're talking about the relation between beings and not trying to found a theory of the one. And I think that this is the theory of multiplicities in a nutshell. Going to your statement about chaos, I think that, for Deleuze and Guattari, chaos is not the absence of determination, but the infinite speed within which determinations take shape and dissolve. That is kind of the interesting upshot of, if being is multiple, if there is heterogeneity and connection, then chaos is something that not only has to be warded off, which is easy enough to do with opinion, but obviously philosophy can't resolve itself with that, nor can art or science, right? Art has to fight against its cliches. That's one way of warding off chaos. Science has to ward off, I don't know what we would call it, superstition, pseudoscience. Philosophy has to ward off opinion. These negative images are all ways in which we protect ourselves against chaos, and they give us a little bit of stability in the world. And we often fall into that when we're not thinking, when the world doesn't force us to think, when thoughts don't come from the outside, problems don't form. But when they do, we have a different relationship with chaos. That's when philosophy is able to use the concept in order to get a little bit of organization out of chaos. Same with science and the functions, and art with affects and percepts. All of that, I think, feeds into your question about chaos, and seeing in Atlan some kind of way in which he's looking at self-organization by means of fluctuations or perturbances or obviously noise. And I think that that's his way of theorizing it within his field of biological complexity. And I think that there's a nice, I'll use the word through light again, there's a nice resonance between Deleuze and Guattari and Atlan in that sense.
The second easy reading of chaos equals determinism, and this, I think, would go to capitalism. This also goes back to Taylor and I's discussion of Eros and Thanatos, where order and disorder collaborate. Systems use noise in a productive fashion. Destruction is actually secretly good, so we can think about that in the context of even deterritorialization, reterritorialization, where maybe not, let me scrap that, but I'll just say like the way that creative destruction in capitalism, since the universe is self-organizing or the market is self-organizing and this optimization mechanism, it's all good. There's like a divine plan in place, and we just can't see the divine plan's outcome because we're limited, right? This is kind of the argument against central planning. Individuals can't see the divine plan, but the market has this totalizing, right? Since everything has a price, it can calculate risk, it can assign accurate prices, it can provide us with real guidelines, real signs to follow to make our decisions and to ward off chaos of the future, right? By making, have I paid the right price for this car, for this house, etc. Whatever wager that we're making, that could even go to the suicidal wager of reproduction, right? It's like, okay, what's the cost of reproducing? And do I invite chaos by taking that wager and staking my life on that wager in a certain way, right?
To go back to the very beginning with the Putnam-Davidson discussion, there's a way in which what you're discussing here in terms of that equivalence is, despite what I said, it is actually a synthetic but not an analytic identity. And I think that actually does help capture some of its processual unity without being collapsed in on itself.
The version of this reading would make Thanatos serve Eros, death being life's way of upgrading. The pain is real. The sacrifice that one makes up front and the wager has a payoff, like we get something back. And that way the kind of universe has this teleos. In my interpretation, that's something that Atlan wants to refuse completely. And this is exactly points back to what I mentioned with respect to Freud with Eros and Thanatos that we discussed, Taylor and I, in the ego and the id episode. So if you make one drive serve the other, you've collapsed that opposition. Thanatos is either primary, where life is just a scenic route to death, with Eros binding and delaying that death so the organism can die in its own way. Obviously, that goes back to the very first Dune quote, destruction is the truth, construction being the detour, or Eros is primary, death is just life's way of clearing space for more life, so creative destruction under capitalism. Thanatos breaks down the old so Eros can build the new, construction being the truth of that, destruction being the means. So both of those fit that collaborationist model. Both make one subordinate to the other. Both produce that therapeutic resolution that it's all good. The system knows what it's doing. Pain serves a purpose, which is the justification for capitalism, right? The sacrifice that you make as a laborer pays off because you get a wage, you get life back from your employer or something like that. I don't think that Atlan he insists no, that that's not the case. The opposition between Eros and Thanatos, between life and death, are actually real. There are actually stakes. There is a conflict. There is not collaboration. The errors are real. They don't secretly serve God's plan. Chaos actually threatens, genuinely. There is a cost. Some errors destroy the system entirely, like species do go extinct. People do die. You make a wager whenever you skydive, right? You can lose that wager. You can lose that wager in a car accident, right? We're always making wagers based on information that we have and projecting out into the future, even if it's a sort of unconscious process and we're habituated to it. That's what we're constantly doing. And that's kind of the idea behind the marketplace in a certain way, right? Is this arbitrage of consequence and action. But I'll stop there for a moment. Too much. I took too much of the adrenochrome or something.
No, I think that again, I think the reflections here are interestingly, they are circulating around life and death, which I think makes very good sense here. But it does bring me back again to my interest in how Atlan tackles finitude and event. And I don't think he really does. And I want to open up that as a question to both of you, again, because we're weaving in Deleuze and Guattari here as well. But thinking about that notion of eventimentality, where does that exist in this register of ontogenesis that Atlan has set up for us?
I think that comes back to his way of looking at the past and the future. And it's precisely that way in which he draws upon the Hebrew language and obviously some Talmudic conceptions and looks at like how the past is dealt with by the intellect, right? It's what we know. This comes back to the known unknown distinction. Whereas the future is the part of the soul that's oriented towards the future is that which is unconscious and also that which can surprise us and be something novel. And so I think that that's where he also distinguishes between the repetition of the solar year, which is etymologically linked to, again, in Hebrew, for that which is not new, it's something expected, versus, and this goes back to Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. And he says, yes, but the lunar month is etymologically related to that which is new. And so there's above the sun, if you will, is the moon. So if there is nothing new under the sun, above the sun, there is something new. And that's kind of where I think he's trying to think about what we might today almost cynically just call emergence, right? But, the notion of the event, obviously for Atlan, he doesn't directly conceptualize it in the way that Deleuze does, but I think that there are resonances when he comes to talk about the irreversibility and reversibility of time, and when he's thinking about the way in which, for him, like he sees information acquisition, learning, and these other things to be dimensions of the event that do include something novel, even if we may reduce them to not being strictly speaking, because he'll want to say, strictly speaking, self-organization is linguistically, semantically impossible. Strictly speaking, learning something new is linguistically, semantically impossible. But outside of that, strictly speaking, self-organization occurs. And we do learn from something unexpected and surprising and new. And so I think that that's kind of the interesting thing about Atlan is his rigor as a scientist, but his wonder as a philosopher.
That notion of the sublunary does really bring in some of the importance of Kabbalistic cosmogony in the way that he thinks about things, and he does weave it in very well with the Sheberat HaChilim, the shattering of the vessels, and Tikkun Olam as the repair of the world.
Yeah.
So there is a cyclicality here, but it's a cyclicality that allows for a sublunary notion of novelty and a sublunary notion of free will as well. And I think that that's very important in this this way, again, that he would look at Adam Kadmon and various other Kabbalistic concepts and that reformation of the body of the universe. His way of weaving that into some of those deliberations, not using the vocabulary event, but as you're talking about irreversibility and reversibility in the golem and everything else, I think that there's a capacity to do a very eloquent fusion of this sort of atheistic Kabbalism with natural sciences.
Because of some of the things that Coop brought up and is interested in, it would be nice to, obviously, Conor, have you back at the very least when it comes time for our translation to come out. That would be something that if we don't have another circumstance that seems to present itself, that at the very least would be like a reason to come back and we can talk about.
We could do a session on underread Deleuzians and do a little bit of a repartee or a dialogue around Sauvignargues, who's obviously not really underread, but around Philippe Meng, maybe. That might be a good sort of segue to go. So, and Sauvignargues is an exceptional Deleuzian, and now Taylor and I are hoping to be working on Philippe Meng's magnum opus, Deleuze, Le Système du Multiple.
And I'm glad, by the way, that we did this on Atlan. I know it was cool getting into him and seeing what he has to say. And also, I think that Coop, I know you said you enjoyed some of this stuff. So I think it was like a very well fitting for our projects.
I do at least want to read this last passage, key passage, I think, from Atlan, just to follow up on kind of my claims that I was making and make sure we're grounding this into this text. And then we can figure out if we want to continue. I have a ton of shit. I have a ton of stuff. It might be sufficient to consider organization as an uninterrupted process of disorganization and reorganization, and not as a state for order and disorder, the organized and the contingent construction and destruction, life and death, to no longer be really distinct. However, that is not at all the case. The processes in which this unity of oppositions realizes itself cannot exist except inasmuch as errors are a priori true errors, inasmuch as order at a given moment is truly perturbed by disorder, inasmuch as destruction, while not total, is real, inasmuch as the eruption of the event is a real eruption, a catastrophe, a miracle, or both at once. Ooh, that really ties in nicely to chaos equals determinism.
Well, and the notion of miraculation also brings in sort of some of the thaumaturgic stuff that he's driving at during his Kabbalistic explorations. Again, I think it's really sort of a good ritornello as we started the essay, the discussion with today, to some of those very important points around how he structures the emergence of being, again, emergence being that overused word, but that emergent naturalism that he's driving at throughout the corpus of his work.
There's an interesting resonance with Deleuze and Guattari and reterritorialization and deterritorialization here, because they say that deterritorialization is never an absolute, right? I think there's a resonance, or like there's a rhyme between what Atlan's saying here and Deleuze and Guattari there too that I hadn't even thought of earlier.
And I think, honestly, Coop, as I open the dialogue with, I think it is so interesting to see that he is not in dialogue with any of these thinkers, and we are clearly finding all these different echoes, traces, lineages, which I think obviously came out de novo in Atlan, because I don't think he necessarily read these people. Again, the one person, as we noted near the beginning in Between Crystal and Smoke, that he actually engages with very directly is Rouillet and his book, The Gnosis of Princeton, where he really sort of like the preformationism that and sort of spiritual preformationism that Rouillet sort of really embraces in that book. He really guts, and it's quite interesting. I just wanted to riff off what you just read and this is where I'm really seeing the echoes in Serre, and this is from Hermes, the second volume of Hermes, which is Interference. And I think that this also taps back into some of the levels things that you were talking about. Again, this might end up being edited out. I don't know, but let's just see how we go. Is reading morphic strata an endlessly iterable operation? By the very number of variational techniques allows at some point inverting the variation by considering the model to be an intersection of X number of previous variations and a union of X morphic strata. The invariant is no longer the morphe, but the object itself, as that which from the various morphes have been little by little removed through communication with other models, as the complement of the union of these strata. Hence the second question, should the hylae be considered to be always endlessly pushed back? At what moment of the successive ungluings is bare hylae discovered? That is to say, the non-inscribed tabula rasa. Is the morphological study of what is inscribed on the palimpsest so endless that tabula rasa would be no more than a limit horizon? Science undoubtedly seems to endlessly distance this horizon. The unfolding and reading of the signifying layers, historical, physical, crystalline, molecular, atomic, etc. This seems an infinite task that would push matter back like a horizon, from which it results that matter would indeed be an idea. Only the ideology of endless progress makes this result seem probable, yet nothing could be less certain. That there is instead a bound would be attested to by the existence everywhere of stochastic chaos.
My instinct, my intuition is that my next quote actually jives with this perfectly, but let me see what you think. Let me read this. And just to contextualize this for the audience, this is a passage from Children of Dune, and this is a mentat. This is Duncan, Idaho. He knew he was not in the proper mentat calm for such an assessment, but he had to try. He had to be as precise as possible. At the same time, he knew that precise thinking contained undigested absolutes. Nature was not precise. The universe was not precise when reduced to his scale. It was vague and fuzzy, full of unexpected movements and changes. Humankind as a whole had to be entered into this computation as a natural phenomenon, and the whole process of precise analysis represented a chopping off, a remove from the ongoing current of the universe. He had to get at that current, see it in motion.
Yeah, I think that does riff on it, and that actually also brings up one of Taylor's favorite Deleuzian concepts, which is the anexact. And I think that that comes in there quite directly, where that the closer we get to that full-on, again, absolute survey, absolute surface, whatever you want to call it, the more that we're sort of gaming ourselves and not understanding, again, this notion of accession or something that is a boundary leak. And I think that that's very important, because I think it also gets back to noise and what noise does. And again, I think the notion that Atlan is very clear about that, and this sounds like sort of an agrammatical phrase, but complexity is not a simple. It is not simple. It is always a complex.
I think this too goes back to the opening discussion that I brought to bear with the Liet Kynes quote about immanent causality, which doesn't necessarily mean predictability. Everything is determined, but the texture of that remains vague, right? There, as Duncan says, it's fuzzy. The surprising, there are real errors. The unexpected is a real, genuine unexpected. And so I don't know if that's a good place to maybe stop the episode.
Just to riff on that too, I think that that's really where Atlan is actually attacking the neo-Darwinism and is bringing in, not referencing it directly, but things like neutral drift. The determinism that he is dealing with, which is very scientifically mediated, is very sophisticated and nuanced. It isn't a simple unveiling of the code or a decoding or ciphering of what is already there. So I think that that's very important to understand, that this isn't simply a game of ontological forensics. And there is definitely, the game that is at foot is non-deterministic.
Yeah, I'm just looking over my notes. I think that's probably a good stopping point. I think we've kind of touched on a little bit of the other stuff that I wanted to, even if it wasn't as in-depth as I was hoping for. But if there's anything that you want to put a coda on the episode for in terms of our discussion today, or any projects outside of what you're working on with Taylor directly, I just want to give you the opportunity to do that before we go ahead and close out the episode.
What I'm going to do is I'm just going to put another quote in here, and I'm just going to, you can cut this out if you want. It's mainly for you, because I think it's just interesting. And this, I think, is important. the far-ranging and meandering nature of this episode is partially because of that lack of direct engagement that Atlan has with the philosophers that we have been discussing here. It is a speculative episode in that sense because we are imagining, fabulating, fictioning these potential interrogations which have never happened, but which would be wonderful to see. And I think, as Coop said, the Simondon one is particularly noisome at one level, but also particularly promising at another level to see what would happen if we brought these thinkers together in a really careful and deliberative manner. I just want to finish because I think it's an interesting quote on finitude, because again, we've been talking about finitude throughout, and this notion of pluralism and monism and all of these synthetic identities. And this again is from Jean-Luc Nancy. It's from The Sense of the World. Finitude should therefore be attributed to what carries its end as its own, that is, what is affected by its end, as limit, cessation, beyond essence, as by its end goal, finishing completion, and is affected by it, not as by a limit imposed from elsewhere, from the outside of supposedly essential, infinite immanence of the essence to itself, from the outside of an essentia, absolute and null, but as by a transcendence or passing away so originary that the origin has already come apart there. The origin, too, it first of all entranced and abandoned. Existence is exposed. It is this exposition itself, not to a risk that comes from outside, as it is already outside. It is being outside, not to an adventure in the element of the foreign. It is already being foreign, being estranged in the mode of a Hegelian consciousness, which, however, has also contributed to the modern history of our finitude. It is exposed to and by the X that it is, exposed to and by this swooning of the essence, which is older and more affirmative than any constitution of essence, and which constitutes existence. That is, which throws toward the world, toward itself insofar as it being thrown toward the world, and toward the world insofar as the world itself is the configuration or constellation of being toward in its plural singularity.
Interesting. I think that definitely has some ties to some of the what I'm kind of investigating with the book project. We'll leave that an open question. We'll chop it off there to be Amtal and Fremen, good Fremen about it. But Conor, I just want to thank you for coming on, and that will wrap up another edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. We'll see you all next time.
Until next time. Thank
The
you.
very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, the whole state of things, the pure bias without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.